Hi guys, one of the things I really believe in the way I orientate my life is that everyone has a story and that everyone's story is important and everyone's story is worth being listened to. And I believe that no matter who you are, your story is powerful. And one of the main reasons why your story is powerful is because it tells you who you are. And of course, we are dynamic beings, we're always changing. And as we change and as we grow and as we mature, even as our stories change, they shape that growing, changing, maturing process. And basically our stories shape who we are becoming. That's the power of stories. But it's not just your story telling you who you are and shaping you and changing you. There's bigger stories as well. People want to tell you their story, hoping to form you, hoping to shape you. And it could be the bigger stories of culture or government or your boss or your parents or marketing companies. There's all these other bigger stories out there, and some of them actually very helpful, others less so. But for me, I think the ultimate bigger story is the story of God. I think God has a story, and I think it tells us who we are meant to be, and I think it tells us who we can be. And I think it might surprise you, actually. You might have an idea of, oh yeah, Christians believe that this is who God wants us to be. I think what the story of God says about who we are and how it seeks to shape us might surprise you. I believe that inside the story of God is the story of us. And inside the story of God is the story of us revealing different facets of our identity. And the facet of our identity that I want to talk to you today about is the fact that humans have a prophetic identity. And maybe you hear this term prophetic and you think, oh, that's a bit weird. And, you know, it's about hearing God's voice. And it's about speaking about the future. And there's elements where that's true about what it means to be prophetic. But sometimes we can reduce the idea of prophetic identity down to only using the gift of prophecy and hearing God's voice. But actually, our prophetic identity is given to us as a response to human brokenness and exploitation around us. Prophetic identity is the identity that says the world is not the way it should be. Things are wrong and broken and they need to be fixed. Who's going to do that? I will. I'm going to partner with God in doing that. So I believe that God is wanting us to rise up, to know his story, to know our story inside of his story, and to take hold of our prophetic identity. And to take hold of that prophetic identity out of an encounter with God, to respond to exploitation and to see people set free, hopefully set free to worship him, to worship God. And I believe that if we can join our prophetic identity to God's prophetic identity, then we can realize what it means to be a people that are on a mission to fix everything that's been broken. So I want to read to you, and you might think that this passage is strange, but bear with me. I'm going to read to you the 10 Commandments from Exodus chapter 20. And let me just read that out to you, and I'll share some thoughts about it. So Exodus chapter 20, verse 1. And God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth below, earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God has given you. So that is the story of the 10 Commandments. Actually, I only read up to the 6th commandment. You can read the whole bunch, all 10 of them, in Exodus chapter 20. But this is basically the story of the 10 Commandments and how they were being given to Israel as kind of like the core of the principles of how they're meant to live. So if you just hear me reading out these 10 Commandments, or the first 6 at least, then I would forgive you for thinking that God is all about the rules. Do this, don't do that. And that kind of feeds into the stereotype of what it means to be a Christian. There's rules to follow. Do this, don't do that. And maybe that's one way to see the Ten Commandments and to think about who God is and his heart towards us, that he's a rule giver. But I think that misses something. Actually, I think of the Ten Commandments, I think of them as God's principles for living a flourishing life. And that actually they're a reflection of his heart for us. That actually they're a reflection of his prophetic heart for us. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at the command, or the principle, as I like to think of it, about the Sabbath. Let me read this out to you again. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. So remember the context, or let me tell you the context. But Moses, who is meeting with God, receiving the Ten Commandments, Moses has just led the Israelites, the people of God, out of Egypt. And the Israelites, they were slaves in Egypt, racial-based slavery. And they were exploited. And they were made not to work 6 days out of 7. They were made to work 7 days out of 7. Moses has just led the Israelites out of Egypt and away from the exploitation that they had experienced. And God is leading Moses into this encounter with him, and he's hearing about God's heart in the Ten Commandments. And God's intention that he's communicating to Israel was to give the Israelites principles that would promote flourishing and to protect them from exploitation. So God had freed the Israelites, and his principles would help them to continue living freely. And we're looking at this concept of the Sabbath. So Israel was surrounded by cultures, and they just come out of a culture that had enslaved them, that made them work 7 days a week. And Israel was surrounded by cultures that ran their workers into the ground. And here, in God's foundational laws, the Ten Commandments, he's saying, I want human beings to have a day of rest. I want them to be more than just cogs in an economic machine, to achieve some kind of goal that a king wants, or to just to get rich and attain material wealth. So when I look at the principle of honoring the Sabbath by not doing any work in it, and remember, that was for the servants of Israel as well. It's for even the foreigners in Israel. So this, what looks like a command, don't do any work on the Sabbath, is actually a principle to give life. You can trust me to provide for you. You don't need to work 100% out all the time. You can take rest. I will take care of you. You deserve to not be exploited in terms of your economic output. So rather than a command to control and to contain people, this commandment of the Sabbath, to rest on it, is actually a principle for flourishing life. It was a principle given for freedom. It's a principle given for flourishing. Okay, so that's the Sabbath. Let me look at the command on idols in verse 4. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heavens above, or on the earth beneath, or on the waters below. So, just like God didn't want human beings to be exploited by more powerful human beings, making them work every day, God also didn't want his people to be exploited by unclean spirits. So the making of an idol and worshipping it is to give unclean spirits, demons if you will, control in our lives, which often come with fear. God's heart is for freedom from enslavement, whether it's from people or from the spiritual realm. And when we become subservient to other people, having to work for them 7 days a week, or when we become subservient to other spirits in our world, and maybe some of us come from a culture where the idea of other spirits is that's just reality. And maybe some of us come from a culture where the idea of other spirits is like, oh, that's a bit superstitious. I think both of those cultures, whatever end of the spectrum you come from, then we can all point to things that cause us to become under control and subservient, and to maybe almost be enslaved to, whether it's a physical idol or something that becomes addictive in our lives. God's heart is for freedom. And that's what's communicated in this one of the 10 commandments. Don't have idols. God's heart is for freedom from enslavement. And when we become subservient to other gods, spirits, or things in our world, then that's the outcome, enslavement. Once again, the framework isn't to think of the 10 commandments as this is a command, do this, don't do that. It's actually this, and it's not, this is not a principle of God being jealous and petty. It's actually a principle of God wanting us to be free. Perhaps you haven't encountered unclean spirits, but you've seen how other things exert some kind of fear or control in your life or in the life of others. And this idea of don't worship these idols, don't be enslaved to them, is God's heart that we as human beings would not be exploited. And remember the context. God had set his people free from physical slavery in Egypt, and he didn't want them to be enslaved again. Once again, it's a principle for flourishing, not a command to control. So we looked at the Sabbath, we've looked at idols. Now I just want to look at one of God's principles, the 6th commandment for human relationships. Verse 12, honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God has given you. Honoring our parents, I think, is deeper than just writing them birthday cards and doing what they say when we were kids. And often this is how this is talked about. We tell kids, you need to honor me as your father and you need to obey me. And I think this principle that God has actually goes deeper than that. I believe it was a principle that expressed provision and care for the welfare of our parents. And it's not so much about obedience, but it's about protecting the vulnerable. You know, as I'm older, my mother now is in her 70s, and I'm stronger than her. I could take advantage of her and all this kind of stuff. And you think about the culture of Israel at its time and the culture of the nations around it. Old people become a liability. And God's saying, when your parents who gave you life, when they look to you to take care of them, then do that. Honor them. That word there, honor, can literally be translated pay. Pay your father and your mother. Look after them for what they've done for you. When they're weak and relying on you, you take care of them. So it's not so much about obedience, and we can talk about that as well. There's that element. But it's actually about protecting the vulnerable. So more than a love for rules, God has a deep love for the welfare of his creation, including elderly parents. Knowing our tendency to neglect and knowing our tendency to take advantage or to exploit others on our behalf, God was, and he continues to urge us to treat each other with dignity and value. So I believe that the story of God contains the story of us, our prophetic identity, something that is inside of us that reacts to injustice and exploitation. And maybe that prophetic identity inside of us at the moment is small, maybe it's big, but I believe it comes from being made in the image of God. The 10 Commandments shows God's heart for humans to not be exploited, to be free, to flourish, whether that exploitation is from spirits or things or from other human beings. God shows his heart, his prophetic heart in the 10 Commandments, not commands to control, but principles to live life to the fullest, free from the exploitation of others and free from being the exploiter of others. So I've just gone over 3 of the commandments: Sabbath, idols, and parents. But what I've talked about here applies to all of them. They reflect God's prophetic heart, and they are called to point us to our prophetic identity. Anyway, that's what I think. I wonder what you think. Here's some questions to hopefully provoke some discussion. First set of questions. When you hear the 10 Commandments, how do you see them? As rules, protection, as love, as control, freedom? Does remembering that Israel had just been freed from slavery change how you hear these commands? All right, next group of questions. If the Sabbath command is actually about protection from exploitation, what might that say about God's priorities? How might the command about idols relate to freedom rather than restriction? And in what ways could honoring parents be about protecting the vulnerable rather than enforcing obedience? And then the other commands. What about the other commands? How can they be viewed as an expression of God's prophetic heart for us? Remember, prophetic heart is stopping exploitation, healing brokenness. Finally, how might practicing Sabbath be a prophetic act in today's world? Are there modern idols that create fear or control in people's lives? And what would it look like for us to reflect God's prophetic heart in practical ways this week? Well, that's all from me, guys. Thank you so much. Love to hear some of your thoughts somehow. Thank you.